The dinner table at the Vance estate was set with bone china and silver, a perfect tableau of old-money Manhattan elegance under the warm glow of the chandelier. But beneath the pristine white tablecloth, Ethan noticed his wife's foot was not resting near his, but angled sharply toward the guest sitting across from them. Her business partner, Julian. It wasn't the distance that chilled him, but the way she smirked when their eyes met. A look that held a secret sharp enough to sever their 5-year marriage before dessert was even served. If the quiet unraveling of a marriage behind closed doors speaks to the part of you that craves the truth, stay with me. There are layers of betrayal here that we haven't even begun to peel back, and I'd love for you to witness what happens next. The silence inside the Mercedes was heavier than the sleet hammering against the windshield. Ethan Caldwell kept his eyes fixed on the taillights blurring ahead on the Long Island Expressway, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. Beside him, Elena was a silhouette of sharp angles and cold perfume, the blue light of her iPhone illuminating a frown that hadn't left her face since they left Manhattan. "You missed the exit," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the distinct, weary edge of someone forced to tolerate an incompetence she found exhausting. "It's the next one, Elle. They changed the construction pattern," Ethan replied, keeping his tone even. He had learned that defending himself usually only prolonged the prosecution. Elena sighed, a short, sharp exhale through her nose. She tapped a final message and locked her screen, tossing the phone into her designer clutch as if it were a weapon she was holstering. She turned to look at him, her gaze sweeping over his tweed blazer and the slightly frayed collar of his shirt. It was an inspection, not an observation. "Did you at least pick up the wine I asked for?" she asked, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a gift he hadn't bought her. "The 82 Bordeaux. It's in the back," Ethan said. "And I brought the sketches for your grandmother. She asked to see the plans for the winter garden." Elena let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Ethan, please. Nobody wants to look at garden sketches tonight. It's Thanksgiving, not a contractor's meeting. Julian is going to be there, and I don't need you boring him with talk about soil, pH, and drainage." The name landed between them like a stone. Julian Thorne. The man had been a shadow over their marriage for the last 6 months, a mentor in Elena's venture capital firm, a name that popped up on her lock screen at midnight, a presence that made Elena dress differently, laugh louder, and look at Ethan with this new, terrifying indifference. "I didn't know Julian was family," Ethan said, tightening his grip on the wheel as he merged onto the exit ramp. The tires crunched over the slush. "He's important to the firm. He's important to my future," Elena corrected, turning away to look out the window at the dark, passing woods of the Hamptons. "He's closing the merger deal next week. Daddy loves him. Just try to be useful tonight, Ethan. Pour drinks, make small talk, and don't bring up your situation." "My situation?" "Your firm," she snapped, her patience finally snapping like a dry twig. "You haven't had a commission in 6 months. It's embarrassing, Ethan. Everyone at that table is a heavy hitter. I just don't want you to look like a charity case I'm dragging along." Ethan felt a cold hollow open up in his chest. He remembered a time, not so long ago, when she looked at his sketches with wonder, when she called his work visionary. Now he was just a balance sheet liability. He pulled the car up the winding gravel driveway of the Vance estate. The massive house loomed ahead, windows glowing with golden light, promising warmth that he knew wouldn't extend to him. As he put the car in park, he turned to her, a desperate need for connection surfacing. "I love you, Elena," he said quietly. She paused with her hand on the door handle. She didn't look back at him. She just checked her reflection in the visor mirror, wiped a smudge of lipstick from her tooth, and opened the door. "Just bring the wine, Ethan. And don't drop it." The cold wind rushed into the car as she stepped out, leaving him alone with the hum of the engine and the certainty that he was walking into an execution. The heavy oak door swung open, releasing a wave of warmth scented with rosemary, sage, and expensive beeswax candles. Ethan stepped into the foyer, the cold air still clinging to his coat, the box of vintage Bordeaux heavy in his arms. He kicked the door shut with his heel, shaking off the slush from his shoes. But Elena was already 3 steps ahead of him, shedding her coat and smoothing her dress with a frantic sort of anticipation he hadn't seen in years. "Mother? Daddy?" Elena called out, her voice pitching up into that bright, practiced tone she reserved for people who could do something for her. "In the drawing room, darling." Her mother's voice floated back, accompanied by the clinking of crystal and the low murmur of male laughter. Ethan hung his own coat in the closet. He reached for Elena's cashmere wrap to hang it up as well, a reflex of habit, but stopped. She had already dropped it carelessly on the entryway bench, too eager to get inside to bother with tidiness. He picked it up, brushed off a speck of lint, and placed it on a hanger. It was a small, invisible labor, the kind that defined his entire existence in this house. He walked down the hallway, the Persian runner muffling his footsteps. As he rounded the corner into the drawing room, the scene before him made him freeze. The room was a golden tableau of wealth and comfort. A fire roared in the oversized hearth. Elena's father, Richard, stood by the mantel with a scotch in hand. But Richard wasn't looking at Elena. He was listening raptly to the man sitting in Ethan's usual leather armchair. Julian Thorne looked as if he had been born in that chair. He held a tumbler of amber liquid with relaxed confidence, one leg crossed over the other, the polished toe of his shoe catching the firelight. He was wearing a velvet blazer that cost more than Ethan's first car, and he was laughing. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to suck the air out of the room for Ethan. "Julian?" Ethan said, the name tasting like ash. The conversation halted. Elena, who had just rushed over to kiss her father, turned. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright, not with the stress of the drive, but with the thrill of seeing him. "Oh, Ethan," Elena said, her tone flattening instantly. "You remember Julian, don't you? He was in the neighborhood visiting friends, and Daddy insisted he stop by." "In the neighborhood," Ethan repeated. The Vance estate was 5 miles from the nearest main road, hidden behind iron gates. Nobody just stopped by the Hamptons estate on Thanksgiving. Julian stood up, a fluid motion of practiced grace. He set his drink down and extended a hand that was perfectly manicured. "Ethan, good to see you. I hope I'm not intruding. Richard and I were just discussing the liquidity issues in the Asian markets. Fascinating stuff." Ethan took the hand. It was dry and firm, a handshake designed to dominate. "I didn't realize you were working today, Julian." "Money never sleeps, as they say." Julian smirked, his eyes flicking over Ethan's shoulder to Elena. "And neither does beauty. Elena, you look breathtaking. That color is dangerous." Elena blushed, actually blushed. Ethan watched the blood rise in her cheeks, a reaction he hadn't elicited from her since their honeymoon. She touched her necklace, a nervous, girlish gesture. "Thank you, Julian. You're too kind," she murmured. Then, snapping back to reality, she looked at Ethan. "Well? Don't just stand there holding the box, Ethan. Take the wine to the kitchen. The staff needs to decant it now if we want it to breathe by dinner. Right, Ethan said, his grip tightening on the wooden crate. The staff. Here, let me take that for you. Old man, Julian offered, taking a half step forward but making no actual effort to grab the heavy box. It was a performative gesture, meant to highlight Ethan's burden, not to alleviate it. I've got it, Ethan said, stepping back. Good man, Richard boomed from the fireplace, finally acknowledging his son-in-law. Make sure you ask Martha for the corkscrew. Last time you broke the cork on a 95 Petrus. Let's not repeat that tragedy. The room chuckled, a polite, exclusionary sound. Elena laughed the loudest, her hand resting lightly, briefly, on Julian's velvet sleeve. Ethan turned away, the laughter chasing him down the hall toward the kitchen. He felt less like a husband and more like a delivery boy who had lingered too long in the main house. He pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen, the noise of the party cutting off abruptly, leaving him in the stark, bright silence of the service area. He set the wine down on the counter with a thud that was too loud, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was inside the house, but he had never been further from home. The dining room was a cavern of mahogany and velvet, illuminated by the trembling flames of tapered candles that cast long, dancing shadows against the silk wallpaper. Ethan took his seat, not at his usual spot to Richard's right, but further down the table, a subtle demotion that placed him directly across from Grandmother Rose. The matriarch sat in her wheelchair like a statue carved from granite. Her hands, gnarled and covered in liver spots, rested motionless on the table linen. She did not speak as Ethan sat down. She merely watched him with eyes that were clouded with cataracts, but seemingly sharp as glass. Ethan gave her a small, respectful nod, which she did not return. At the head of the table, Richard carved the turkey with the precision of a surgeon, while the staff poured the wine. Not the vintage Ethan had brought, he noticed, but a bottle Julian had apparently supplied. To success, Julian proposed, raising his glass. The crystal sang as it touched Elena's. And to the merger. It's not every day we reshape the skyline of Manhattan. Here, here, Richard bellowed, his face flushed with pride and alcohol. You're a shark, Julian. That's what I like about you. You smell blood, and you swim faster. Elena took a sip of her wine, her eyes locked on Julian over the rim of the glass. Julian was just telling me he secured the funding for the Hudson Yards expansion. It's a 9-figure deal. Ethan focused on cutting his meat, the silver knife scraping screechingly against the porcelain. He felt invisible, a ghost haunting the feast of the living. He hoped foolishly that he could simply fade into the wallpaper until the coffee was served. And what about you, Ethan? Richard asked abruptly, the sudden attention feeling like a spotlight swinging onto a prisoner. Still playing in the dirt? How is that little landscaping thing going? Ethan set his fork down. It's landscape architecture, Richard, and it's going steady. We're bidding on a restoration project for the botanical gardens. Bidding? Julian repeated the word as if it were a synonym for begging. He swirled his wine, looking amused. That's the trouble with government contracts and nonprofits. All passion, no margin. I've always wondered how one sustains a lifestyle in this city on aesthetics. It's not just about aesthetics, Ethan said, his voice tight. It's about creating sustainable spaces. Legacy. Legacy is what you leave behind in the bank for your children, Ethan, Elena cut in. Her voice was ice cold, stripping away any pretense of spousal support. She didn't look at him. She was picking a pine nut out of her salad with focused disdain. Let's be honest. The firm has been in the red for 2 quarters. If it were one of my portfolio companies, I would have liquidated it months ago. The table went silent. The air grew heavy, thick with the unsaid accusation. It was one thing for her father to mock him. It was another for his wife to publicly audit him. I'm restructuring, Ethan defended, though he hated how weak the word sounded. The market is shifting. The market is booming, Julian corrected gently, a predator toying with a wounded animal. For those who know how to navigate it. Elena was saying you refused to take on the commercial plaza project in Jersey because it lacked soul. That's a luxury, Ethan. Turning down revenue because of soul is a hobby, not a business. I have standards, Ethan said, looking at Elena, pleading silently for her to stop this. Standards don't pay the mortgage on the loft, do they? Elena replied, meeting his gaze finally. Her eyes were hard, devoid of the warmth he used to find there. Daddy had to cover the maintenance fees last month. Did you tell them that part of your restructuring plan? Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't known she knew. He hadn't known Richard had told her. The humiliation washed over him, hot and suffocating. He looked around the table. Richard was smirking. Julian wore a mask of pity that was far worse than scorn. And Grandmother Rose simply watched, her expression unreadable, her fingers tapping a silent, rhythmic cadence against the tablecloth. I intended to pay him back, Ethan whispered. Intention. Richard chuckled, stabbing a piece of turkey. Is a poor currency, son. The silence that followed Richard's comment about the currency of intention was not empty. It was pressurized. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing his hand to unclench beneath the table. He could feel the heat radiating from his collar, a physical manifestation of the shame burning through him. He looked at Elena, waiting for a glance of reassurance, a sign that she regretted exposing their financial struggles to her father and her lover. But Elena wasn't looking at him. She was signaling the waiter to refill Julian's glass. Look, no need to be grim, Julian said, his voice smooth like oiled silk. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, invading Ethan's space from across the centerpiece. I might have a solution. My firm is looking for a property manager for one of our holdings in Queens. It's not architecture, obviously, but it's steady work. Good benefits. I could put in a word for you, Ethan. It would help get Richard off your back about the loan. The condescension was so thick it was almost tangible. Julian wasn't offering a job. He was offering a handout to the man whose wife he was sleeping with. Ethan set his napkin down. I don't need your charity, Julian. And I certainly don't need you managing my debts. He turned his eyes to Elena, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. And I don't appreciate you discussing our private finances with your father behind my back. Elena slammed her wine glass down. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The crystal didn't break, but the illusion of civility shattered instantly. Private finances? Elena laughed, a high, brittle sound that lacked any mirth. She turned in her chair to face him fully, her eyes blazing with a mixture of wine and long-suppressed resentment. Ethan, there is nothing private about your failure. It is public knowledge. It is the elephant in this room every single time we gather. Elena, that's enough, Ethan said, though his voice wavered. No, it is not enough. Her voice rose, echoing off the high ceilings. I am tired of pretending, Ethan. I am tired of walking on eggshells around your fragile ego while I carry the weight of our entire life. You talk about standards and soul? Those are excuses for laziness. I work 12 hours a day, Ethan protested, the injustice of it stinging his eyes. I maintained the apartment. I handled the renovations. I took care of your mother when she was sick last year while you were in Tokyo with Julian. You changed a few light bulbs and managed the contractors, Elena scoffed, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. That isn't a career, Ethan. That is what a house sitter does. I need a husband. I need a partner who brings something to the table besides sketches of gardens that will never be built. She stood up, towering over him in her heels, her shadow stretching across the table. The room was deathly still. Even Richard had stopped eating, his fork suspended in midair. Look at you, she sneered, her gaze raking over him with utter disgust. You sit there, drinking Julian's wine, eating my father's food, living in my apartment, and you have the audacity to have pride. You are a drain, Ethan. You are an anchor around my neck. She leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and suffocating. You are absolutely, undeniably useless. She laughed again, a cruel, incredulous sound, as if the absurdity of his existence was the funniest joke she had heard all night. Useless, she repeated, tasting the word, ensuring it landed with maximum impact. Ethan sat frozen. The word hung in the air, vibrating. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching the scene from the ceiling. He saw the smirk on Julian's face, a subtle, satisfied twitch of the lips. He saw Richard nodding in agreement. He saw the waiters averting their eyes. He had been stripped bare. There was nothing left to defend. The woman he had married had just murdered their relationship in front of an audience, and she was smiling about it. In the ringing silence that followed, the squeak of a wheelchair wheel turning on the hardwood floor sounded like a scream. The echo of Elena's laughter seemed to linger in the corners of the room, a ghostly sound that curdled the air. Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed on the untouched linen napkin in his lap. He felt hollowed out, as if the insults had physically scraped away his insides. He prepared to stand, to leave, to accept the exile they were forcing upon him. Are you quite finished, Elena? The voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a diamond cutter through glass. It came from the end of the table. Grandmother Rose had not moved, but her head was now lifted, her clouded eyes fixed unerringly on her granddaughter. Elena blinked, the cruel smile faltering slightly. Grandma? I was just explaining the reality of the situation to Ethan. He needs to hear it. The reality, Rose repeated. She reached into the pocket of her shawl and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, creased, and looked out of place among the silver and crystal. You speak of reality with such confidence for a child who has never paid a bill she didn't forward to a trust fund. Mother, please, Richard interjected, wiping his mouth nervously. This isn't the time for— Quiet, Richard, Rose snapped without looking at him. You are as much a fool as your daughter. She turned her wheelchair slightly, the rubber tires squeaking on the parquet floor, aligning herself to face the entire table. You called your husband useless, Rose said, her voice gathering strength, the tremor of age vanishing. You called him a drain. You mocked him for fixing the house, for managing the contractors, for his little garden sketches. You laughed at him for being a liability. Because he is, Elena insisted, though her voice had lost its sharp edge. He doesn't bring in money, Grandma. He costs us money. Rose unfolded the paper. This is the invoice for the structural underpinning of the East Wing, dated 6 months ago. The cost was estimated at $250,000. The contractors refused to work until the deposit was paid. She paused, letting the figure hang in the air. Julian shifted in his seat, looking suddenly bored, checking his watch. I don't recall seeing that withdrawal from the family account. Richard frowned. Because there wasn't one, Rose said. The trust is illiquid, Richard. You know that. We are land rich and cash poor. When the foundation cracked, we were facing condemnation. Who do you think fixed it? Silence. Ethan designed the structural reinforcement himself, Rose continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. He called in favors from his old crew. He spent 4 weeks in the mud under the floorboards, welding steel and pouring concrete with his own hands so you wouldn't lose your ancestral home. He paid for the materials out of his own savings. The savings you claim don't exist. Ethan looked up, stunned. He hadn't known Rose knew. He had done the work at night, on weekends, telling Elena he was handling maintenance. He never told them the cost. He just absorbed it. And the tax lien? Rose asked, shifting her gaze to Richard. The $60,000 in back taxes for the boathouse? The city was going to seize it last month. Richard went pale. He gripped his Scotch glass. Ethan paid it, Rose said simply. He sold his mother's engagement ring. I saw the receipt in his coat pocket when the dry cleaner came. The room went dead silent. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Elena stared at Ethan, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting from him to her grandmother. The useless man, the drain, had been the only thing standing between them and ruin. You measure worth in mergers and acquisitions, Mr. Thorne, Rose said, turning her steel gaze to Julian. You come here, drink our wine, and smirk at a man whose fingernails are dirty because he is holding up the floor you are standing on. She looked back at Elena. You didn't marry a useless man, my dear. You married the only man in this room who understands the meaning of duty, and you just humiliated him for it. Rose placed her hands flat on the table. You wanted to talk about who is a drain on this family? Let's talk about your venture capital losses last quarter, Elena. Shall we discuss why you really needed Julian's help tonight? The silence in the dining room was broken not by an apology, but by the scrape of a chair. Julian Thorne stood up, smoothing the front of his velvet blazer with a practiced, detached efficiency. The predator had realized the water was no longer safe. I think, Julian said, checking his watch with a feigned grimace of sudden remembrance, that I have overstayed my welcome. There are some early morning calls to Tokyo I need to prepare for. Richard, Elena, thank you for the hospitality. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at Rose. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps receding down the hallway like a rat abandoning a sinking ship. His departure was the final insult. He hadn't even stayed to defend Elena. Ethan placed his napkin on the table. He didn't look at his wife, whose face had gone from flushed to a sickly pale. He looked only at Grandmother Rose. Thank you, Rose, he said quietly. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the untouched turkey and the shattered ego of the Vance family behind him. He needed air. He needed to get away from the suffocating scent of expensive candles and hypocrisy. He didn't make it to the front door before he heard the click-clack of heels on the hardwood floor behind him. Ethan, stop! Elena's voice echoed in the high-ceilinged corridor. It wasn't the commanding tone she used in boardrooms. It was shrill, laced with panic. Ethan stopped his hand on the brass doorknob but didn't turn around. Go back to your dinner, Elena. The wine needs to breathe. Don't you dare walk away from me, she hissed, grabbing his arm and spinning him around. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for the submission she was used to finding there. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me sit there and say those things knowing you had paid for everything?" Ethan looked down at her hand on his sleeve, the diamond bracelet glinting in the foyer light, and felt nothing. No anger, no love, just exhaustion. "I didn't let you do anything, Elena," he said, his voice flat. "You said what you truly thought. The fact that I paid the bills doesn't change how you see me. It just makes you look foolish for not knowing your own ledger." "I have been busy keeping this family afloat," she argued, though the conviction was gone. I thought you were just drifting. Why did you sell your mother's ring? You should have told me we were in trouble." "I tried," Ethan said. 3 months ago. I tried to talk to you about the overhead costs. You told me you were in a meeting with Julian and couldn't be disturbed." "You were in meetings a lot this quarter." Elena flinched. The name hung between them, heavy and accusatory. Ethan took a step closer, backing her slightly against the hallway table. "Rose asked a question back there, Elena, about why you really needed Julian's help. It wasn't just about the merger, was it?" "Julian is a business partner," Elena said, the lie coming out automatic and rehearsed, but her eyes darted away to the left. "Don't," Ethan said. The single word was a command. "Don't insult me any more tonight. I've taken enough. I saw the way you looked at him. I saw the text messages popping up on your phone at 2 a.m. I saw how he looked at you like he owned you." Elena's mouth opened, then closed. The defiance drained out of her posture, replaced by a terrified realization that the game was up. She looked at the door where Julian had exited, then back to Ethan. It's complicated," she whispered, tears finally pooling in her eyes, tears of frustration, not remorse. "You withdrew, Ethan. You became so small, so passive. Julian, he's aggressive. He makes things happen. I felt alone." "You weren't alone," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was right here. I was under the floorboards holding up your house. You just chose not to see me." He reached for his coat. "Where are you going?" Elena asked, panic rising again. "You can't leave. Grandma is still watching. My parents—" "I don't care about the audience anymore, Elena," Ethan said, buttoning his coat. "I'm done performing." The foyer was drafty, the cold seeping in from the gap beneath the heavy oak door where the weather stripping had worn away. Another thing Ethan had noted to fix next week, a task that now belonged to someone else. He wound his scarf around his neck, the wool scratching against his skin, grounding him in the physical reality of the moment. "You can't be serious, Ethan," Elena said, standing at the foot of the stairs. She had crossed her arms, hugging her elbows as if she were the one who had been stripped bare. "It's freezing out there. The roads are icing over. Just sleep in the guest room. We can talk about this in the morning when everyone is rational." "I am rational, Elena," Ethan said, picking up his car keys from the silver tray on the console table. The metal was cold against his palm. "For the first time in 5 years, I am completely rational." "You're being dramatic," she snapped, the old reflex of dismissal kicking in before she could catch it. She took a breath, softening her tone. "Look, I know tonight was intense. Grandma was out of line. I was stressed. But you can't just leave on Thanksgiving. Think about how that looks. My parents are still in the dining room." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the panic in her eyes, but it wasn't fear of losing him. It was fear of the narrative slipping out of her control. She was already calculating the spin, the explanation she would have to give to her father, the awkwardness of a breakfast table with an empty chair. She wasn't fighting for her husband. She was fighting for the preservation of the image. "It doesn't matter how it looks, Elle," he said softly. "It matters what it is." He reached for the door handle. "Who is going to drive me back to the city on Monday?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Ethan paused. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. Even in the wreckage of their marriage, her first instinct was logistical. She was already cataloging the inconveniences of his absence. "Call Julian," Ethan said, not looking back. "He's the one driving the merger, isn't he? Let him drive you." He pulled the door open. The wind hit him instantly, a biting, icy gust that stung his face and filled his lungs with sharp, clean air. It was violent, but it felt honest. "Ethan!" she called out, her voice shrill and small against the roaring wind. "If you walk out that door, don't think you can just come back when you run out of money." He stepped onto the porch and pulled the heavy door shut behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was final, a heavy thud that severed the connection to the warmth, the light, and the lie inside. He walked down the steps to the driveway. The sleet had turned to a steady, freezing rain. His shoes crunched on the gravel, the only sound in the vast, dark expanse of the estate. His car sat where he had left it, a modest sedan parked next to Richard's Bentley and the empty spot where Julian's Porsche had been. He got in, his hands shaking slightly, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of the release. The interior of the car was freezing. He started the engine, and the dashboard lights flickered to life, casting a pale green glow over the sketches he had left on the passenger seat. The plans for the winter garden Rose would never see. He picked up the roll of paper. For a moment, he thought about leaving them on the doorstep, a final act of service. But then he remembered Elena's laugh. He remembered the word useless. He tossed the sketches into the back seat. They belonged to him. The talent, the vision, the ability to build and repair. That was his. They couldn't foreclose on that. He put the car in reverse, the tires spinning momentarily on the slush before finding traction. As he drove down the winding driveway, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The Vance estate glowed on the hill, a magnificent, impregnable fortress of old money and older secrets. From a distance, it looked perfect. Ethan turned onto the main road, the darkness swallowing the house behind him. He didn't know where he was going to sleep tonight. Maybe a motel off the LIE, maybe his office floor. But as the heater kicked in and the wipers cleared the view ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He had never been more useful to himself than he was right now. The April sun in Brooklyn was not polite. It was blinding and energetic, bouncing off the exposed brick of the converted warehouse and warming the back of Ethan's neck. The air smelled of wet concrete, sawdust, and the early bloom of jasmine from the trellis he had installed yesterday. Ethan rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, wiping a streak of dirt from his forehead. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't holding a wine glass. He was holding a trowel, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel tired. The Caldwell and Associates sign hanging on the chain-link fence was small, but it was his. No investors, no board of directors, just him and a small team revitalizing urban green spaces. "Ethan?" The voice was tentative, almost drowned out by the sound of a circular saw in the distance. Ethan stood up, brushing the soil from his jeans. He turned to see a woman standing near the gate. It took him a moment to reconcile the figure with his memory. Elena looked thinner. The sharp, terrifying precision of her appearance was gone, replaced by a frayed elegance. She was wearing a trench coat that looked slightly too large, and her heels were sinking into the soft mulch of the garden path. "Elena," he said. He didn't step forward to hug her. He stayed where he was, behind the raised planter bed, a natural barrier. "I didn't think you'd come all the way out to Bushwick." "I had to see you," she said, stepping over a coil of hose. She looked around the site, her nose wrinkling slightly, but the disdain was weak, lacking its old venom. "It's quaint. Is this the botanical garden contract?" "No," Ethan said. "This is a community center, pro bono for now, but we have 3 commercial contracts starting next month." "That's good. That's really good," she stammered. She looked lost. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant traffic. "What do you want, Elena?" She let out a shaky breath, hugging her purse to her chest. "Grandma Rose died last week, Ethan. I thought you should know." Ethan felt a pang of genuine sorrow. He took off his work gloves, setting them on the ledge. "I'm sorry. I truly am. She was a force." "She left you something," Elena said quietly. "In the will, a small endowment. She said it was back pay for services rendered. She admired you, Ethan, more than she ever admired me." Ethan nodded slowly. She saw things clearly. "She cut me off," Elena blurted out, the composure cracking. Tears spilled over, hot and fast. "Before she died, she froze the trust. She said until I learned the value of $1 earned, I wouldn't see a cent of the inheritance. Daddy is furious. The estate is in probate." "And Julian?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Elena looked down at her shoes. "Julian left in January, the moment the liquidity dried up. He said the merger was too high risk without the family capital backing it." "You were right about him. You were right about everything." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I miss you, Ethan. I'm drowning. The apartment is too expensive. The firm is struggling. I need someone who knows how to fix things." It was the truth, finally. But it was a selfish truth. She didn't miss him. She missed the handyman. She missed the buffer between her and the world. Ethan looked at her, and then he looked back at the garden. He saw the structure he had built, the plants taking root, the team of young architects arguing happily over blueprints in the corner. He had built this from nothing. He was useful here. "I can't help you, Elena," he said gently. "But you love me," she whispered. "I did," Ethan corrected. "I loved the version of you that I thought needed protecting. But you don't need protection. You need to learn how to survive on your own. Just like I did." "I can't do it alone," she sobbed. "You have to," Ethan said. He picked up his gloves. "It's the only way you'll ever find out what you're actually worth." He didn't wait for her to leave. He turned back to the planter bed, kneeling down into the dirt. He heard her stand there for a long moment, waiting for him to turn around, to cave, to save her one last time. But Ethan kept working. He dug his hands into the earth, feeling the cool, solid ground beneath him. He heard the click of her heels retreating on the pavement, fading into the noise of the city. He didn't look back. He had a garden to build,